Cary's Government Access Channel.
We have called to order the meeting of the Planning and Zoning Board for February 26th. We will begin with adopting our agenda. If anyone has any changes to our agenda, would you make them known? Otherwise, I'd be looking for a motion to adopt the agenda.
I'll make a motion to adopt tonight's agenda.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All those in favor of adopting the agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say no. That motion is unanimous. We have two sets of minutes to look at. Does anyone have any changes to either the work session minutes or the regular meeting minutes? We'll look at those together. If not, I think we can do an motion to adopt both sets of minutes if someone would care to make one.
So moved.
Is there a second for that?
Second.
All those in favor of approving the minutes for both the work session on January 29th and the regular meeting on January 22nd, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say no. That motion also is unanimous. This is normally the time where I would go through all the rules for our public hearing, but since we do not have a public hearing this evening, 3 of our cases are without public hearings, I will not go through that list. Rather than, I'll just talk about how we handle cases that have no public hearing. The staff will introduce the case individually, and then after the staff is done presenting it to us, the applicant will have 10 minutes to speak with us. After that point, we can ask questions of either the staff or of the applicant. Then we will deliberate the case and render a decision, and we will do that for each of our 2 rezonings and for our act change to the ordinance. We begin this evening, though, with the Twin Lakes PDD 17 REZ 29. Mr. Rye is with us. Good evening.
Good evening, Board. This is a request to amend the existing Twin Lakes Plan Development District at 3624 Davis Drive. The site's located on the eastern side of Davis Drive. It's between Airport Boulevard, you can see here to the north, and Lake Grove Boulevard. It's actually a portion of a larger site which extends from this portion down to Lake Grove Boulevard. The applicant's proposing to amend a portion of the property. The site is part of the Twin Lakes Plan Development District. It's undeveloped with the exception of an existing cell tower located on the southeastern portion of the site. The site to the north will be developed into a shopping center called the Twin Lakes Center, which is where the future Wegmans will be located. This area is also a part of town that's located adjacent to the town of Morrisville's jurisdiction. There's an existing house which is adjacent to this site. You can see located right here, and it shares 3 borders with the subject property. That's in Morrisville, also properties to the south and across Davis Drive in Morrisville. A little further north, though, is within the town of Cary, and in fact, there was a rezoning that was recently approved right at the corner of Airport Boulevard and Davis Drive. The existing zoning for the site's Planned Development District. You can see that with the purple color located here. Properties in white in this map are within Morrisville's jurisdiction. Twin Lakes is a planned development district of more than 200 acres. The 5 remaining undeveloped tracts for Twin Lakes are designated as mixed use or MU parcels. They share allowances for retail, office, restaurants, multifamily, and assisted living facilities. The applicant's proposing to create a new sub-district in the northern portion of the MU3 parcel here. So the MU3 parcel currently runs from this northern property boundary down to the south. So they're proposing to carve off a portion and call it MU3 North. This use would be limited to a maximum of 200 multifamily age-restricted units. The remaining MU parcels would still have the full allowance to the uses and square footage maximums which are shown in this table. The applicant's proposing the following revisions to be associated with MU3 North with this rezoning request. First, to limit the use to 200 multifamily units, which would be age-restricted, meaning that 80% of the dwellings would have at least one person age 55 or older. They're proposing to increase the community gathering space to at least 2,000 square feet. This is 800 square feet above the requirement per the LDO. Proposing a parking ratio of 1.3 spaces per unit. Removal of the buffer between MU3 North and an adjacent residential property. And I'll show you exactly what that's referring to in this slide. So regarding the removal of the buffer, this illustration shows the location of the property. You can see on this map here, there is a 20-foot buffer required adjacent to Davis Drive and a 25-foot type A buffer adjacent to the single-family parcel, which is in Morrisville, this property right here. So the applicant's proposing that this buffer be removed if they can develop this parcel in conjunction with the larger development. And the way that would work would be if they can develop it with the larger development, you can have a site that crosses jurisdictional boundaries. There would be a site plan that would be reviewed by both the town of Cary and the town of Morrisville. They're also proposing to clear or remove existing vegetation and replace it within the planted streetscape. The applicant has submitted a tree survey of the site, which is attached to the staff report, and they've noted in their justification that the survey revealed no significant trees or upper story specimen trees. They've also noted that the streetscape would need to be disturbed to accommodate the burial of power lines, and you can see in this image here that much of the streetscape has actually already been cleared. Staff has evaluated the case using the Imagine Cary Community Plan. First, we look at the site's future growth framework map designation, which is commercial center. Commercial centers are described as having at a minimum a shopping center of 5 to 10 acres or more anchored by a supermarket or equivalent, and they may have residential, office, or institutional uses incorporated into the center. These can be either mixed vertically or horizontally on adjacent sites. When we look at the site under the Live chapter of Imagine Cary, staff's made the following observations. The rezoning seeks to add multifamily housing choices for seniors, and we know within the next few decades there will be an ever-increasing demand of housing types for seniors. And the site is in close proximity to multiple shopping centers in the area. There's not current access to transit. However, Imagine Cary does have a long-term goal of providing Go Cary services on Davis Drive. Looking at the work chapter, staff has evaluated the case under policies 1 and 2 with respect to housing for workplaces and 2 and 8 with respect to employment locations. The site is a prime location on Davis Drive. It's within a few miles of RTP. It would be ideal for younger households actively employed in or near RTP. Also, when looking at policies 2 and 8 of the work chapter, staff notes that while MU3 is, as it exists today, 14 acres, is probably not a viable site for major corporate campuses. The site is likely quite viable for mixed-use office buildings, neighborhood office, or mid to small format office buildings. Such building space could provide locations for smaller firms servicing RTP corporations. When looking at the town of Cary's GIS map, staff notes that there may be stream buffers adjacent to the site on the east around the existing ponds within Twin Lakes. Looking at the Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources Facilities Master Plan, it has identified a greenway corridor located adjacent to the site to the east. According to the Transportation Plan, Davis Drive is a major thoroughfare. And there were multiple opportunities for citizen feedback through the rezoning process. First was a community neighborhood meeting held here at the town hall on November 1st. There were questions and discussion items around the proposed use and the density, questions around the potential building height, the future location of the greenway, which would be to the east. At the public hearing, there was no speakers other than the applicant. There were some questions from council regarding the development plan process, specifically if this site's developed crossing into Morrisville's jurisdiction, how the development plan process would work. And as I mentioned earlier, there could be a plan for one site that crosses jurisdictional boundaries. So with that, staff finds the rezoning to be consistent with Imagine Cary. The site is in a commercial center on the Future Growth Framework map, which also notes that residential uses may be mixed vertically or horizontally. Additionally, this rezoning provides additional housing options for seniors. So staff's preliminary recommendation is for approval. This concludes staff's presentation. The applicant is here to share comments. Following that, staff will be available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and members of the board. I'm Jamie Schwadler with Parker Poe, 301 Fayetteville Street, here on behalf of the applicant. I'd like to thank Ms. Dry for that thorough presentation, and I won't belabor many of the points that she made, but I'd just like to highlight what it is we hope to accomplish with this rezoning, why we chose the site, and why we would believe it's consistent with the Cary community plan. First, what we're offering at the site with the combination of the zoning conditions before you on the screen. This site was chosen by the applicant for one of its signature products called Overture that's been popular in about 30 jurisdictions across the nation. And what it is an active adult community that provides a segue for people to age in place in their community, to leave the maintenance and the upkeep of a single family home and to transition into an active adult community where they can still remain in the community, not have to leave their church, not have to leave their children and their grandchildren, but have less maintenance, have walkable amenities, and have somewhere to go that is not quite the needs of an assisted living or dependent care facility. And so what we're offering is that age-restricted community where the 80% of the dwellings will have one person at least 55 or older. It's going to be 200 multifamily units. And the reason why we were drawn to this site is because it's a part of the Twin Lakes PDD that was already entitled for an assisted living facility. But what we're offering is just a little bit different from that assisted living. Again, it's between the bridge of the single family and assisted living, and so that's why the rezoning is necessary. So what we're doing, as Ms. Dry explained, is just affecting one of the 5 parcels that were designated as MU. We're talking about MU3, a portion of MU3, which we'll call MU3 North. There's only 6 acres, and we're taking that and just changing the designation from that variety of uses down to the age-restricted multifamily use. Now this, as I said, has been popular across the nation for many reasons, and not the least of which is that people like to be close to walkable amenities. They like to be close to commercial centers. They like that connectivity, and that's what drew us to the Twin Lakes site with the Wegmans development that was approved by the Cary Town Council last summer. Kate did a great description of describing those key conditions, but in our mind, those key conditions really responded to the concerns of the community that we've heard throughout this process. They were concerned about the height of the existing facility, which was allowed to be 96 feet. We're bringing that down to 66 feet. We're also increasing the community gathering areas so people have a place to gather and to take advantage of that Hatches Pond there at the lake. Following those meetings with the residents, we've had positive feedback and going through the process, and we thank staff for working with us on there. I'd like to just highlight the 3 areas of consistency and then explain the 2 modifications. First, as Katie said, the most obvious area where this is consistent with the Cary Community Plan is the Live chapter. There are numerous areas throughout the Cary Community Plan that focus on Cary's aging senior population, where they will go, where they will live. And that policy too mentions multifamily as a specific unit or product type that's available and desirable for seniors to be able to age in place. This responds obviously directly to that concern. Second, with the SHOP chapter, this is consistent with the future growth framework map, which designates the site as commercial center, and is described as having daily retail and service needs for nearby neighborhoods. Commercial centers may also include residential uses such as multifamily. So again, it's recognizing that this type of commercial center and this specific type of multifamily is appropriate for this type of location. And then finally, under the work chapter, I'd just like to emphasize that we're not taking office away from any of those other MU parcels. It's just simply one portion of one parcel where we're changing the designation to limit that only to age-restricted multifamily. And the reason we're doing that is because the use of our patrons really limits itself to just having different traffic patterns that are low impact. We didn't need a traffic study for this proposal, and what we're doing is really decreasing the burden on this parcel by having a very low impact use. For those reasons, we respectfully request your support in moving this forward with approval to the Cary Town Council for consideration. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I'll start on this side of the room. If anyone has any questions of the applicant or of the staff in this case?
I do not have any questions about this. I think it's appropriate and a good idea.
We'll just keep on going down.
I have a quick question for staff, and that's in terms of the streetscape and basically accessibility in terms of sidewalks, and I can't remember every foot along the way, but will there eventually be sidewalk build out, let's say from airport all the way down to Carpenter?
Along the frontage of the site?
Yeah, along the frontage. I'm thinking about just walkability, in terms of folks living on that site being able to walk along up to Wegmans and down to Starbucks, if you will.
Yeah, there will be, the sidewalk will be installed as the sites develop.
Mm-hmm.
So we know Twin Lakes Center with a future Wegmans is going to be, it's in plan review now. And so once that's constructed, that'll be completed with sidewalk. There will also be sidewalk requirements for this site. And so as they develop, each development will be installing the sidewalk.
Okay, but eventually, long term, will be connectivity
Yes.
along there? Okay.
Yes, definitely.
Part of the design. And is this, I'm just out of curiosity, I know we're just looking at the one particular site, but is this part of the site to the south of this also this development, or is it just on this location only?
Are you referring to the site?
Yeah, the site
L-shaped?
north on the MU3.
Yes. So the MU3 portion
That's a,
will still have the entitlement to the list of uses and square footages that are allowed for all the MU parcels. So this will not affect its entitlement. It'll still
Okay.
have full access to those uses.
all right, just curious. Thank you. I don't have any other questions.
Okay, Steve?
Just one quick question. I think you said this earlier, the power lines are going to be buried?
Yes.
Same thing from Airport Boulevard going down, that'll be a requirement?
Yes, and I believe the Twin Lakes Center does have plans to bury the power lines along this. Yes.
Okay.
I just confirmed with the plan reviewer, yes.
Okay, thank you.
I don't have any questions either.
Yeah, I just had one question. We keep pursuing this thing about covenants to make it age-restricted, and I don't want to get down in the weeds on that. But I did wonder if there was going to be some sort of owners association provided under the covenants that would have the authority to enforce those restrictions.
I believe the way our condition works is the covenant would have to be recorded, as is going through the plan review process with the town. But then it would be up to the development moving forward to decide if they wanted to keep that in place or not.
And that was sort of my question is there a homeowners association under the covenants that would have authority to enforce those covenants?
I believe so. Oh, would you be able to speak to that a little bit?
I'm not sure that there'd be necessarily a homeowners association associated with this, but they would be recorded with the Register of Deeds and so enforceable with respect to the covenants. And that's a requirement that will face a development plan, I believe.
Okay.
You mentioned something about the boundaries around that little house that's sitting there embedded in the middle of that property. Could you go over that again?
Sure. So right now, the Plan Development District shows a 25-foot type A buffer that needs to be installed around that site.
And what does that mean?
What that means is that they would have to reserve 25 feet. Let me find the slide to speak to that. Give me just a minute. So this is an image of the buffer map that was recorded, or that was part of the Plan Development District when it was originally approved. And it shows this parcel MU3 here with a 25-foot type A buffer on all three sides of that single-family home. So that means if this site were to develop today, 25 feet are on all sides would have to remain undisturbed, and they would have to have a type A buffer, which is an opaque buffer. So if the plantings that are there naturally do not achieve that opacity, they would have to install additional plantings to make sure that there's, an opaque buffer between this single-family home and this development. So the applicant is proposing to remove that buffer if they can develop this site in conjunction with a larger site. So if they're able to obtain this single-family home and develop it in conjunction with a larger site, then that buffer would go away because it would be part of this larger site.
I understand.
And that site, like I mentioned before, is in Morrisville, so it would also require a site plan that would be reviewed by the town of Cary as well as the town of Morrisville, crossing jurisdictional boundaries.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Thank you for the presentation, Ms. Dry. The cell tower, which is pre-existing, I wasn't clear, is that going to remain or is that going to be taken down?
I believe it's going to remain from what I understand.
Got it. And would this particular residential proposed development, would that be something in our land ordinances that if the cell tower was not there pre-existing, would that be something allowed in this type of residential development?
No, cell towers are not listed as a permitted use, so it wouldn't be allowed if it was put there, if it was a new development. It'll be allowed to continue to operate if this rezoning gets approved. It would be a legal non-conforming use.
And our rationale for why we would not allow a cell tower to be installed in a residential area, could you just speak to that? Why we don't allow that?
I don't know if I'm the most appropriate person to speak to that, but I know in general, we typically, if you look at the residential categories within the land development ordinance, those are not zoning districts that we would have cell towers in. And we have someone from plan development who can come speak to that a little bit more.
Hi, Doug Loveland, Planning Department. Mobile communication towers are allowed in residential districts depending on their design and their height, allowed by right. In the LDO, we have a separation requirement in a residential district. Now, this is PDD, this is a little different, but as context, we would require separation from a single-family detached lot from a communication tower for aesthetic reasons. It's separated by the height of the tower simply because you have a lower intensity use in a detached house from the communications tower. So that's an aesthetic requirement. It's not a separation based on safety. So for uses, multifamily or non-residential uses, there is no separation because we feel that's more intense use. In this case, the communications tower is not permitted because that's how the PDD was set up.
So given it's multi-residential, we could allow a cell tower to come in, or we would still preclude that if it was after the fact the multifamily neighborhood was built?
Well, in this case, the PDD, if I'm not mistaken, doesn't allow it. So if it wasn't there already, it couldn't come in just because that's how this particular plan development district is crafted.
And our principal concerns about adding them to an existing neighborhood is primarily aesthetic, as what you've said.
Correct.
And buffers would apply, but maybe not so stringently here because it's a multifamily situation.
You buffer from a property line, so there's no property line between the cell tower and the multifamily to buffer, as I understand it.
Okay, so they could be conceivably right up close to the fence that's around the base of the cell tower right now?
Correct.
Okay. Do you have a profile photograph perhaps of the cell tower? It's a little hard to see from above. What it looks like, driving by it on Davis Drive, it's got a lot of stuff hanging on it. It's a pretty visible one, which you can't see when you're driving north at all because the low trees prevent you from seeing it. But if you drive south on Davis Drive, you can see it. And given the likely scenarios, a lot of these trees are all going to get cleared in this area as typically occurs. There will be no lack of visibility of this for certainly all of this development. Again, from the aesthetic point of view, it will be quite observable.
Unfortunately, I don't have a profile. I think the best picture I have that would show the location is just this overhead aerial. And you can see the cell tower location on the eastern portion of the property.
Yep, okay. I think I'll just leave it at that.
Mr. I answered all my questions already. I have none.
Okay, does anyone else have anything for the staff? If not, does anyone have a motion in mind?
Yeah, I'll make a motion. I'd like to make a motion to move that the board forward case number 17 REZ 29 to Town Council with a recommendation for approval as it is consistent with the comprehensive plan and all other applicable plans and is reasonable and in the public interest for the reasons discussed.
Thank you. Have we a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Any discussion?
I think this is a very good use for the property. Any type of senior-oriented housing to come through here, I think is a plus to counterbalance out the commercial that's going to be built on Davis Drive. I'm excited to hear, it's going to be walkable. I would not recommend anyone try to cross Davis Drive, but if you're on this side of Davis, walking to the Wegmans or whatever would probably be conducive. And I just think it should blend in well with the surrounding community that's going to come up there very soon.
Anything to add?
I'd second it because I think it's also a good use of it. I see this as, if it comes to fruition as the applicant envisioned, there'll be a vertical Del Webb is what it's going to be. If you're familiar with the Del Webb communities, it's going to be a vertical Del Webb. And, there's going to be a fair amount of development continuing at the Wegmans. We get a large residential area that's going to connect with via airport. So I think it's going to be fitting within that. And I think some of the conditions are reasonable. Certainly the age-restricted housing options is certainly well worthwhile considering. I think the parking is reasonable, particularly on senior housing. We've seen that in previous cases that have come before us. It's got some interesting nuances to the site, but that'll be the applicant's problem.
Just to be clear, the Del Webb thing is just an example.
Oh, it's an example. Yes, I am sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Yes, if I could use an example, yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Just an example.
Anyone else? And I'll remind you, if anyone plans on voting against it, I'd like to hear from you too. Anyone? Yes.
I plan to vote against it.
Care to share why?
I think my questions point why. I think this is a great plan in many ways, and I really regret saying no, but for many of us who have the privilege of living in Cary, we don't have to have in our neighborhoods cell towers like this with all the aesthetic issues related to them. And, I'm thinking about our future Cary residents that, I'd not like to say to them, welcome to the neighborhood and welcome to Cary, your new home under a big cell tower like this. So I'm thinking about them, and it's not something I'd like to see in my neighborhood. And I think, I just struggle with it, but that's where I'm coming at.
Anyone else? Okay, would all those in favor of 17 REZ 29 please say aye? Aye. Any opposed say no? We just have the one, so we are 8-1. The motion passes. Thank you very much. And we move on to 17 REZ 26, and Ms. Bierman's with us this evening.
Good evening, Board. This is a request to amend a portion of Tract 7 of the Regency Park Plan Development District, and the site is located at 12,040 Regency Parkway. This property is outlined here in yellow. It does back up to US 1. It has frontage on Regency Parkway, and it's located just to the north of the Regency Cottages, or Renaissance Cottages at Regency. As I mentioned, it is a portion of Tract 7 of the Regency Park Plan Development District. What you see here in the black outline is the total area of Tract 7 in the Regency PDD. Within this area, the Plan Development District calls for up to 240,000 square feet of office space. The subject property, which is the southern piece, is developed currently with 120,000 square foot office building, and the piece to the north is currently undeveloped. So that is where the remainder of the entitlement for the office area on this site would occur. The site is located between Regency Parkway and US 1. The proposed rezoning would amend the PDD master plan in just one way. It would increase the amount of parking allowed on the western half of Tract 7, would increase that parking ratio from the current allowance of 3.33 spaces per 1,000 square feet to 4.85 spaces per 1,000 square feet. This would result in up to, well, just a little background. As I mentioned, the site now is developed with 120,000 square foot office building, and that includes 432 parking spaces. Up to 66 additional parking spaces could be added with approval of the planning director, with the way that our ordinance is written. And an additional 84 spaces could be allowed if this rezoning request is approved. So that would basically, if the rezoning is approved, then a total of approximately 150 additional parking spaces could be developed on the site. There are some site constraints. There's a 50-foot buffer along US 1 that is required, and there are also stream buffers along several portions of the site, and any expansion of parking area would have to be maintained outside of those buffers, and actually would have to be at least 5 feet outside of those buffers. Given the topography of the site and the location of existing stormwater facilities, that further reduces the area that could be available for parking. Pretty much there's some area within this circle and that circle. Some of the area within this circle could potentially be available, but there are some stormwater facilities here, both here and here. So the red areas that you see are basically the areas between the building and the buffered areas, but even some of those are limited unless there was more reworking of the site. So the property is designated as a business industrial park on the growth framework map in the Cary Community Plan. The existing office use is consistent with this designation, and I would point out there is no change proposed to the uses allowed on the site or the square footage of use that is allowed on the site, strictly the amount of parking related to the parking ratio. There are 2 policies of the Cary Community Plan that we felt are particularly relevant to this case. In the work chapter, there is a policy that would support to support the locational needs of new and expanding firms, and we feel that the addition of a parking area to accommodate new businesses would be supportive of that. Also, the shape chapter does make reference to appropriate transitions between land uses. Here I would again point out there's no new building area that's proposed with this change, but some additional parking area could be allowed that would be closer to the adjacent residences than is the current case. According to Cary's GIS maps, and as I've discussed earlier, there are some stream buffers along several boundaries of the site, particularly the southern boundary. This does provide some additional or some buffer between the site and the adjacent residences. Property is near the Cocoa-Booth Amphitheater. It has nearby access to a greenway and a street side trail. Regency Parkway is designated as a collector road in the MOVE chapter of the Cary Community Plan. Since there is no change to the land use that's allowed on the site and no change in the square footage of developable area or building development that would be allowed, a traffic study was not required. At the neighborhood meeting for this case, 11 residents of the adjacent neighborhood attended, and there were some questions and concerns related to the buffer adjacent to US 1, traffic, question for the need for additional parking, and some questions about impervious surface. We'll point out that after the neighborhood meeting, the applicant did make some changes to the request, and that included removing a portion of the initial request that would have reduced the highway corridor buffer, which is now 50 feet, by an additional 20 feet. After the neighborhood meeting, that portion of the request was withdrawn. And also, initially, the requested parking ratio was 5.5 spaces per 1,000 square feet, and that was reduced to the 4.85 that is under consideration now. At the public hearing, there were 2 speakers. Again, there was a comment concerning the need for additional parking and the adequacy of the buffer adjacent to the residential uses actually to the south. And also there were some questions and comments from council members related basically to the parking standards, consideration of traffic impacts, and buffer plantings. Staff does find that this rezoning is consistent with the Imagine Cary Community Plan on the basis of being in the Business Industrial Park designation on the Future Growth Framework map, which is supportive of the land use that's is existing. And the fact that we feel that the additional parking that would be provided would support new and expanding firms, which is one of the policies and goals of the plan. And then based on that, staff's preliminary recommendation on the rezoning itself is for approval. And that concludes staff's comments. Following the applicant's comments will be available for questions.
Thank you, Ms. Bierman. We'll hear from the applicant now.
Thank you, Mary. Good evening, Mr. Chair, and members of the Planning and Zoning Board. Jason Barron with Morningstar Law Group here on behalf of the applicant. Just want to hit a couple of highlights and offer some preliminary comments. As was noted in the staff presentation, this site is zoned for office, and that's going to remain whether this case gets approved or not. The areas where parking is currently proposed are areas where parking could be constructed if there weren't a cap contained in the ordinance associated with parking. Those areas theoretically could support construction of additional structures, additional buildings. Again, you'd have to fit them. The ordinance would have to permit it. But from a use standpoint and from what can be done on the land standpoint, nothing's really changing. The problem that this building faces and the owners of this building face is that the market associated with Class A office space, and this is a Class A office building, has shifted fairly dramatically over the course of the last 10 years in terms of how people are using office space. And whereas 3 spaces per 1,000 was at one point a reasonable number to be able to go to market with, that has changed fairly significantly with the vast majority of major employer tenants looking for closer to 5 spaces per 1,000. And so as a result of the feedback that this owner has received as they've gone to market, there's a lot of vacancy in this building right now. They would like to rectify that vacancy. The feedback they've received is that there's insufficient parking to support the types of employers that they would like to be recruiting to this site. And so as a result, we need to rezone in order to permit the change that's before you. The owners would love to get to 5 per 1,000 square feet. And as was mentioned, the original plan called for 5.5 per 1,000 square feet, which would make this a highly competitive option in the marketplace, but also would have required impacting the thoroughfare corridor buffer. When this case was originally submitted, as was noted, there was a request to reduce the thoroughfare corridor buffer by an additional 20 feet in order to facilitate the construction of parking in that area. Based on feedback that the applicant received at the initial neighborhood meeting associated with fairly strong concerns related to that impact, they kind of went back to their plans and determined if that was a necessary ingredient in order for them to go to market, and ultimately determined that they didn't need to impact that thoroughfare corridor buffer. Again, it would have been ideal, but they recognized that that's the way this process works, and so they eliminated the impact, kind of rejiggered the site in terms of where parking can be located, and reduced the request down from 5.5 to the 4.85 that is before you all tonight. I'm going to go to, beautiful, finally getting the hang of this. As Mary indicated, the site has some built-in limitations, fairly significant built-in limitations. It's an odd site. It's pie-shaped. It's bordered on 2 sides by stream buffers, and its other border is US Highway 1, where the thoroughfare corridor buffer exists. As a result of that, there's only so much land that they have to use in order to make the improvements that they would like to. What you don't see as clearly on this as you would on the site plan, which is currently has been resubmitted, I think, it's in the second round of review by the town. There is a Duke Energy transmission line that runs essentially in this area here. As you all are probably familiar, what those transition lines mean oftentimes is that there's only certain things you can do within those easement lines. You can construct parking, but even now Duke is severely limiting people's ability to do that. It limits your ability to put vertical structures in it, and so on top of the site constraints that Mother Nature has placed on the site, you also have Duke Energy Progress easement that has created significant site constraints in terms of their ability to go vertical on the site. So realistically, as a result of this easement, the only place to put a building on the site is where it has been constructed, and the only places where you can add parking are in the areas that have been identified by these circles. As was mentioned, a site plan has been submitted proposing additional parking, and this is not part of the zoning case. I just want you all to understand kind of what the lay of the land is in terms of what we expect to happen. A site plan has been submitted showing additional parking in this area, and this area here. At the public hearing, there was additional questions raised by the community associated with concerns from a visibility standpoint. We met with the concerned citizens on site. We met with the president of the HOA and several members of their board at the site, and our recent plan submittal has actually, we've worked with Duke to essentially grant us the ability to do some additional screening of the parking in this location here. What you don't see real well on this page is that this portion of the parking is fairly heavily screened. This is a densely vegetated 100-foot buffer between the 2 sites. There's a significant grade change between this location and these homes here. These homes drop off fairly significantly, and so this is a much lower section of the site. So from a visibility standpoint, That this 2D version really doesn't demonstrate from a 3D standpoint how fairly limited from a visibility standpoint this location is. When we met with the neighbors, they were much more concerned with visibility associated with additional parking being constructed in this area. As Mary mentioned, there's an existing dry detention pond there that will be replaced as part of that construction. And again, our recent plan submittal to the town has shown a new line of landscaping. Unfortunately, that landscaping is capped at a maximum height of 7 feet per Duke. And so that's, we have done what we have the ability to do, but again, we have a fairly, Duke has fairly strict standards in terms of what you can do within those easement areas. So that's a lot more information than you might otherwise would want, but I just wanted you to know two things. One, there is a plan going through the process consistent with what we are seeking, and that plan does include some modifications that aren't part of the zoning case, but also, too, that we have continued to work with the neighbors to seek to address what concerns they might have. And just from a distance standpoint, there's a fair amount, even though it's not as densely vegetated in this area, there's a fair amount of distance between these two locations. I can't remember what the number is, but it's probably 250 feet. And so with that, we agree with the staff's analysis associated with the consistency of this proposal with the recommendations of the Cary Community Plan. We appreciate their recommendation of approval and respectfully request you all's support of the case as well. And we're here to answer any questions you might have. And that's the royal we, because I think it's just me tonight.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for the applicant or staff? I'll start on this side this time.
No, sir, the applicant covered all questions I had.
Just a couple here. On the target, proposed new number for parking spaces per 1,000, is there any comps, if you will, in this area that can give us a sense that that truly is going to enable this to be more competitive? Because just in my casual driving up and down Regency, I noticed some of the other parking lots, particularly the one right across the street you can see here, is very densely packed as opposed to this one, which seems to be pretty light. So I'm just trying to figure out if this desire to go to the proposed 4.85 spaces per 1,000 is going to make this competitive or still fall short. And again, I'm only relying on driving by the parking lots here, and this is empty, and the other, presumably there's nobody in the building, versus the other buildings that have a jam-packed parking lots.
I will point out there are a couple of other increases that have been approved in this area. Regency Lakeside, which is at 11,000 Regency Parkway. That's 358,000 square feet in two different buildings. There was quasi-judicial meeting where the town council took action and increased that to 4.4 spaces per 1,000 square feet. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the planning director has the ability to increase up to 4.3. And then also Regency Woods 2, that's, I think, adjacent to on the other side of the lake. That one has been increased to 4.3 spaces. So there have been some other increases within Regency. Also, when you look, we did get some figures together for some of the other areas in town. When you look at on the MetLife campus, there's an increase that went up to 4 spaces, with some of those being in a parking deck. And also in Center Green, there was actually an approval that went up to 6.1. So there are, there have been a number of, instances in similar type buildings where the increases have been approved, some higher and some lower than this particular one.
Okay, got it. That's very helpful. With this same picture here, Mr. Bierman, let me also ask, the stream buffers, since this property was originally developed, did not oblige the development to have any additional buffering beyond what's inside the stream buffer. Is that correct? So there's no additional buffering?
There's no additional buffering required.
Okay, so we're not taking anything because it was never there in place. It's purely the stream buffer has been what's been sufficient for the buffering between these two properties. The stream buffer is the only buffer you get.
That's the only buffer you get, but given the location of it, that stream buffer can would qualify as a buffer.
It serves the
between
purpose
uses. It
without
serves
anything
that purpose,
additional?
yes.
Okay, got it. Okay, that's the only questions I have.
Good job.
I don't have any questions.
Chuck?
No.
Neither do I. I'm good.
I have a question, it's just out of curiosity, it's more for the staff, and as this is going forward, this is probably on the site side, I'm just a little concerned about rezoning, which is going to increase impervious surface, potentially lose some of the current stormwater management systems that are there, such as the dry well, right next, some stream buffers we've heard a lot about, flooding, et cetera. I'm assuming this building was built somewhere in the early, mid-90s? Later than that, I see
it was
applicant
later.
shaking his head.
Yeah, it was,
Later than
it was
that.
the mid-2000s.
Mid-2000s, okay.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking that is now, as they alter or modify the parking lot, the parking site, it will mean that that whole site will have to come under whatever ordinances, stormwater management ordinances, regulations that are existing in 2018, so that, you know, regardless how they modify that, the staff will be looking at that and saying, you know, we now have to make sure that whatever the modifications are has to comply. Kind of my analogy would be, when I go to modify my home, I often just have to bring it up, you know, I have to be mindful of the code that's today, not when it was built in 1978. And sometimes I have to address those issues as I go. So I'm just kind of curious. That's kind of the one concern I have about this, is about increasing and get stormwater management practice systems that are there now and adding impervious surface. So just.
And Billy Lee with our Water Resources Group can answer that question.
They will be required to have stormwater control measures for the additional impervious.
Okay.
So there still will be peak flow requirements, there will be water quality requirements associated with what they're proposing.
So it's
now,
not,
whether they modify it or add more, you know, that's part of the site plan.
okay. Thank you.
So-
I won't get too far into.
It's a quiet night for me over here. I don't really have any questions, but I want to agree with the town council's concern about the buffer plantings. But other than that, I don't have anything else.
Any other questions from anyone else? If not, would there be a motion in anyone's mind at this point? Anyone?
Well, nobody, I'll be glad to make a motion.
Be my guest.
Okay, I move that the board forward case number 17 REZ 26 to town council with a recommendation for approval as it is consistent with the comprehensive plan and all other applicable plans and is reasonable in the public interest for the reasons discussed.
I second.
Any further discussions here?
Just you know, for me, I think we talk about these a lot going forward. You know, other than one major employer here, most companies are looking to densify internally. You know, the days of the cube farms are coming to an end, and most companies are trying to maximize their space, and with a lack of public transportation, they're kind of forced into this parking situation. And if you look at Regency, you've got just, you know, a major venue for entertainment there. I mean, this is kind of fulfilling what this area was for. So therefore, I support it.
Anything to add, Vic?
You know, I do know there's been some resident concerns about this from the neighborhood just to the south here. I drove around the neighborhood. It's really you know, as they're developing, it's really a lovely neighborhood. It's beautiful homes, and I'm sure they're not inexpensive. But they are certainly for a part of the market segment that really wants to have, you know, little minimum property around their homes for uptake and that sort of things, I'm sure. But as a result of that kind of a design, there's really no view that most of the homes have of that area at all there. And as the build out, this looks to be an older map, as the other build out has already occurred here. You know, those homes, particularly along the edge at the bottom, I'm sure as they're built out, the neighbors within aren't really not going to see any of this at all, and certainly not even see the freeway, which is probably a bigger element of what's in your scene to the west here. So I do certainly feel for some of the neighbors who are just outside that stream buffer area, because it is kind of thin in some places. But I'm sure that the office building in and of itself was not a surprise when they moved in there being there on the edge. It's something that certainly it was visible then, and it's certainly visible now. But again, I think as they finish out the way they're doing the design, these last homes, I do think it will be potentially very clear to those folks to make a decision if that's something you want to see in that little corner up there or not. But everybody, again, on the inside is not even going to see that anymore as those final homes get built. So I'm sympathetic to the concerns, but I think this is all going to sort itself out in the wash. And I would like to see this office building be a lot more occupied, as we all like to see more jobs here in town of Cary. So I'm very supportive.
Anyone else? Would all those in favor of 17 REZ 26 please say aye?
Aye.
Any opposed say no. That motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much, Ms. Bierman. We are now on to Act 3, which used to be called round whatever of our LDO amendments, but Ms. Schumacher-Georgopoulos is here to walk us through the act.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair and members of the board. The third item we bring you tonight, as you mentioned, is Act 3 for Land Development Ordinance Amendments. Tonight, there are 2 LDO amendments being presented for the Planning and Zoning Board's consideration. Item A sets requirements for the Carpenter Historic Character Preservation Streetscape, and item B includes 3 technical and minor amendments. As Anna Redling reviewed in the work session, the town signed a memorandum of agreement with the State Historic Preservation Office and the Army Corps of Engineers as part of the Carpenter Fire Station Road realignment and grade separation project. In the MOA, the town agreed to consider requiring uniform 50-foot wide streetscape plantings for the new development along some roads in the project area to minimize the impact on the Carpenter Historic District. Therefore, in keeping with the MOA, this LDO amendment suggests updates to the streetscape widths and planting requirements along the portions of Morrisville Carpenter Road, Good Hope Church Road, Lewis Stevens Drive, and Saunders Grove Lane that are depicted here. And as you know, the Carpenter Fire Station Realignment Project will tie Morrisville Carpenter Road into Carpenter Fire Station Road and tie Good Hope Church Road into Carpenter Grove Lane, significantly improving mobility and safety in the area. Consequently, as these road sections are realigned, the roads may need to be renamed. If the Planning and Zoning recommends these proposed streetscape amendments presented tonight for the existing road alignments, staff will return at a later date to update the streetscape requirements for the realigned or renamed road sections. So if the roads are renamed as part of the realignment, we'll be back to update this section of the LDO. And also, these proposed amendments not only meet the standard of the Memorandum of Agreement, but they also reinforce and complement the historic character of Carpenter as specified in the Cary Community Plan. During the public hearing, there was one comment from a member of the Good Hope Baptist Church who was concerned with the effects of the proposed streetscape on the church's future expansion plans. Council asked staff to investigate the opportunities for flexibility in the streetscape requirements, and staff has reached out to discuss the LDO requirements for flexibility. So if they come forward with a plan, there'd be further detail to be looked at with that. Moving on to item B for the technical and minor amendments. Again, there's 3 items here. The first amendment is to amend the ordinance to require that the master sign plans include at least one unifying design element for ground signs and alleviate the requirements for the uniformity of multiple features. The second item is to authorize the Transportation and Facilities Director and the Water Resources Director to accept partial or 0% payment in lieu of required improvements on town and projects. The third amendment is simply to replace the term structure with building in regards to minimum building height in table 6.1-3 of the LDO. During the public hearing, there were no speakers and there were no comments or concerns raised by town council. There was one addition to the language for the second item. So in section 8.1.5, we had originally specified for all town-owned properties will also include now town-owned properties and town projects. And staff recommends approval of the proposed amendments, and we are happy to answer any questions you have as part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions on either item A or B? We'll take them together. I'll start on this side again.
I actually don't.
Nope.
No?
Clean sweep.
Wow.
All right, I believe I have them listed separate. No, I don't. They're together, so we could adopt A and B together in one motion if someone cares to do that. There goes my clean sweep. Steve, you want to make it 3 for 3?
Sure. We have to get the cheat sheet out. Are we doing in the bottom, right?
Motion to approve.
Yes.
And this can all be one,
Yes, just
Correct.
mention A and B as you read it out.
and just call, okay. I move to the board for the LDO amendment, Act, what do you, does that say, did you say Act 3? Does that
Yes.
have the best, okay, thank you. To town council with a recommendation for approval as it is consistent with the comprehensive plan and all other actual plans and is reasonable and in the public interest for the reasons discussed.
Is there a second?
Second.
Discuss it on 3
No,
for 3
no
as well?
comments, it seems reasonable.
Chuck?
You know, we looked at this very carefully during a work session, so I think that's why we're moving along so quickly tonight. And need to thank staff for walking us through it, because there really was a lot of detail, and we appreciated it.
Great.
Yeah, we should mention that. I guess if folks are ever watching these things and they say, wow, they really blow through those, the act amendments, we go very detailed and have a separate meeting to discuss that, which is an open meeting anyone can come to.
We don't do that for rezoning cases, though.
No, just for the LDO amendment, which is why we all seem so smart on those. Sometimes as opposed to our. Okay, well, back to the Act 3. Any other further comments? If not, all those in favor of adopting both items A and B of Act 3, please say aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed, say no. Those 2 amendment changes do pass 9-0. And we have reached the end of our agenda. Does anyone have any new or old business they want to bring up? If not,
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
wow, he beat you this time. All those in favor of adjourning, say aye.
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 We are adjourned.
This has been a production of Cary TV. Visit the Town of Cary's website at townofcary.org.